All right, hey, how we doing out there, guys? So the other day I dropped a video, another one on basic battle tactics, talking about the feigned retreat. So kind of keeping with what I'm doing. So I'm going to use a real life battle or campaign to kind of talk about how it's used in action. So what we're going to talk about is going to be the Battle of Austerlitz. So December of 1805. So the Battle of Austerlitz is considered Napoleon's tactical and operational masterstroke, which comes after the Ulm campaign, which is considered his strategic, zenith when it comes to that. So we'll do a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about the situation. Honestly, the politics and stuff of this era are just absolutely maddening. So I'm not going to presume to know much about them. But what we're dealing with here is the War of the Third Coalition. So obviously one of the Napoleonic Wars. So a couple things that are going on. So the Allied nations, which at this time, would be, the Austrians, the Russians, the British. They form a coalition after the end of the War of the Second Coalition, and they're kind of there's a lot of posturing and naval related stuff and moving around, politically going on. So at this time, Napoleon has about 150,000 men, kind of stationed up in this area here. So basically, it's what he calls his army intended to invade England, which obviously never happens. But so the Austrians, which at this time the Austrians controlled, a large swath of what would be kind of this section here. So I mean, obviously Austria, parts of the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, southern Germany, parts of that, which would be the quote unquote the southern German areas. So this time it's really confusing trying to keep everybody together. Technically, the Holy Roman Empire still exists, which at this time would be essentially entirely, German states. But so in order to kind of deal with the movements of the Austrians and then their the allied Russian troops, Napoleon is forced to execute, what now we call the Ulm campaign. So Ulm is in southern Germany here, so it's between Stuttgart and Augsburg, right here. So it sits on the east side. So this is the Black Forest here around Freiburg, just east of Strasbourg. So what Napoleon does here that's an absolute master stroke because he sends, Marshal Murat, basically in a large cavalry force, and they move in this direction here, and they essentially do a pinning action. So this is considered one of the greatest examples of a turning battle or a turning action, which might be something to talk about in a future time. But essentially they convince the Austrians that this is going to be the main thrust, and this is where the main effort is. Meanwhile, Napoleon famously spreads out his army, and they basically kind of, almost a line from like here to here, move themselves through Germany. It's a humongous undertaking with, with like 7 corps, and so they essentially, Murat successfully pins and convinces the Austrians to focus on this area here. Napoleon essentially comes down behind him over here, obviously near Ulm, and basically just takes them all prisoner. Like, it's one of those, and this happens a lot, like historically, like you kind of always think that, hey, every battle has a point where it's just a tooth and nail knockdown drag out fight, and then okay, then somebody quits. But what happens an awful lot of the time is that the tactical or the operational situation is so bad that one side either just capitulates right there, or they just withdraw and never fight it out because they realize that they're in such a bad spot, and that's what happens in this case. So we can kind of talk this. So here's a pretty decent map of the strategic situation here. So like I said, is all these elements of Napoleon's army are stationed up here, basically. So a little bit up into like the quote unquote the Low Countries and the northeastern France here. And like I said, so they move in all these directions down here, and they basically end up behind and just take they take 60,000 prisoners. So they take like half or like the majority of the Austrian army prisoner. It's just an unbelievably effective and climactic end to that. So now as we move ourselves to the Battle of Austerlitz. So if we think about what's kind of happening here is so Ulm is right here. So the Austrians are withdrawing back towards Vienna, back in this direction. So obviously you can see from München, so Munich here, basically along the roads at the time. back towards Vienna, trying to get on the other side of the Danube. So the Danube runs between Vienna and Bratislava here. This is the Danube, famous river there. So one, they're trying to meet up with their Russian allies that are still en route under Marshal Kutuzov and Bagration and some others, names that are probably familiar to you. So Kutuzov is famously the name that the Soviets used for their counterattack after the Battle of Kursk. And then Bagration is obviously the destruction of Army Group Center in the summer of 1944. So that's where these names come from, as men of this era. So the Allied armies, as they're called, the Austrians, the Russians, they're retreating back through here. They actually do a couple of pretty good rearguard actions. Bagration was known as being a very competent commander. Kutuzov as well. And Kutuzov is placed in overall command of the Allied army, so the Austrians and the Russians at this time. So they retreat, they get across the Danube here at Vienna. And they, some of them like cross around St. Pölten here, and they fight a large holding action. It's at one of these really kind of small towns. Yeah, Dürnstein here. They fight like Dürnstein. It's like all cliffs here, and so they and obviously there's crossings there. So they fought a delay in action there, which is west of Vienna proper on the Danube there. And so where they're heading is, and this is where it's going to get a little confusing. So I'm going to use the German pronunciations and the German names for the towns, because obviously that's what most of history knows it as, because obviously the Austrians speak German. But most of this falls now within the Czech Republic, and so the map will have Czech names, which I don't know how to pronounce Czech names. So it gets a little confusing. Obviously the spellings are different, but that's kind of how we'll do that. So as they're basically retreating to what now we call like Brno, for them it'd be Brünn, was what it was known at the time. This area here, the Czech Republic, and they actually placed the Allied camp at a place called Olmütz, which is this town right here now. So obviously the French pursue them, and what Kutuzov's plan is he wants to get. I'm gonna paraphrase. I'm gonna end up butchering his quote, but he basically says something to the effect of, "I will drag Napoleon to Galicia, and I will bury him there." And so Galicia, if you don't know, is basically like this area. It's like southeastern Poland and like western Ukraine. Like that's Galicia. So he's trying to get Napoleon to follow him a long ways over there. Both sides basically realize that they need to drag the other one into battle, but into a place where it's they need to try to end this campaign. I mean, one is December, but they need to bring it to a conclusion, on the best terms that they possibly can. So as they get strung out, so like I said, the Allied camp, i.e. the Austrians and the Russians, their headquarters is at Olmütz, or Olomouc, however you say that currently. And their lines basically stretch down through this area here. So Slavkov Ubruna, that's Austerlitz. And then we have the towns here. So their lines basically come from Austerlitz, and they essentially come through this area here. And we get into this. This section is called Pretzen and the Pretzen Heights. So this is actually a monument for the Pretzen Heights. So this is Pretzen. Pretzen Heights is a very famous name, obviously, from the battle. So this is the Czech spelling. So they basically, their lines come down through here. So the heights are actually over here. And then the French they're basically spread between, just on the north side. So Schlepanitz, Kolbenitz, Schulpenitz, Telnitz. That's where all their units are essentially through. So Napoleon does a bunch of Napoleon wrangling, and he basically he lets the Allies know that, like, hey, I'm interested in armistice. He actually goes and discusses up at Olmütz with them, and because obviously, like, the campaign, while the Ulm campaign was absolutely completely decisive, Napoleon basically marched his troops for like 4 straight months to conclude that, like, just forced marches every day. And guys, this is one thing I always try to emphasize. I tend to take the side of the fighting man and stay relatively neutral on a lot of battles, campaigns, wars, whatever, because one, I was the fighting man, but it's just that you get lost a lot in oh, what's Napoleon doing, or Davout, or Grouchy, or Soult, or Bernadotte, or whatever those guys are doing. But it's like if you were just a regular line infantryman in a French element, you would have literally woken up every day, marched every second of the day, probably 20 to 30 miles, every single day. You would have pitched camp. You might have started some fire watch, some guard duty. The next day you would have broken down and you would have marched. You would have done that every day for months straight, every single day. And then maybe you would have fought a battle at the end of it. So it's just like unbelievable physical hardships when you're talking about that stuff. So Napoleon, he basically, he needs to get the Austrians and the Russians into a place where he can attack them effectively. But so he kind of goes on the politics side of things. So he goes and talks to him, kind of lets him know he's interested in armistice. They know that their troops have been marching for months. The Austrians have been marching for months. The Russians the same, and all that. So they're kind of strung out, and so Napoleon tries to make himself seem as weak as he can. So the other thing that he has is he has two of his corps stationed further away. So he has one of his corps down in Vienna, which is, it's almost 70 miles away. And then he has another corps, so his corps under Soult is stationed back on this road over here. Basically close enough to be called upon and used, but far enough away that the Austrians and the Russians are not aware of it. And so he basically is kind of playing this game for time, and then to make himself seem even weaker. So originally Napoleon has his troops stationed on the Pratzen Heights here, and I'll flash over to there's a couple good actual maps here. So Napoleon originally has his troops on the Pratzen Heights here. So during this whole kind of faking whatever's going on, he actually withdraws his troops from the Pratzen Heights. So he withdraws his troops from the Pratzen Heights to make himself feel weaker, and then he purposely weakens his right flank, which would be the Allied left, which would be centered around Solkonitz and Telnitz here. So the Allies, kind of take the bait. Kutuzov didn't want to fight here. Bagration didn't want to fight here, but Mack, one of the main commander of the Austrians, wanted to give battle. Everything that they're looking at, they think Napoleon's only got about 53,000 men. In reality, he's got about 78,000 when he calls Soult, and when he calls Friant and Martier in to assist from Vienna. So the numbers are relatively even, about 80,000, a little over 80,000 for the Allied armies. So they take the bait, and they essentially, on the start of the battle, they decide to attack, and they want to attack and overwhelm the left flank, which would be Napoleon's right flank. So we'll flash back to our battle map here. So if we kind of look, so Napoleon, he sets up, so he's got about 7 corps. So he sets up his left flank is stronger, and then you look at so Solkonitz, Telnitz here, looks significantly weak. And then we can look from the map here. So you got like Marshal Davout, and you got Friant and another guy by the name of Martier. They're south here. So it seems that they're not present, or not going to be present for the battle. So now a couple things. So why would the Allied armies, why would they want to attack Napoleon's left flank, or attack him at all here? So a couple things, if we just look at this very simply and logically. All right, so we're over here in Czech Republic, Czechia, in Brno. So Napoleon is from France, and obviously capital and all that's in Paris. So he goes through the entire Ulm campaign. So they end up over here. So Ulm is about halfway between Augsburg and Stuttgart. Then they chase the Austrians all the way through to Vienna, and then north to Brno. So if we look at, roughly speaking, Napoleon's army is right there. So the Allies hope to turn and to attack this flank, so Napoleon's right flank, to cut off his lines of communication from Vienna, and thus from Germany and from France, which makes total sense. We kind of look at what we're dealing with here is, or let's Let's stick with our regular map. So now, obviously, the road situation is better now because it's 2024. But if you look at, this is obviously a very mountainous region, famously so. So if you're Napoleon and you're, in the Brno area and you get cut off from your roads that can take you to Vienna. So one, you've got to get across the Danube, which is obviously a very daunting, a very like a wide river. And then you do not have much for roads coming through this area here. So then you're going to have to attempt to find other crossings in other places, but also with there not being much of a road network there, it means that you're probably going to have troops stacked up on one or a couple of roads, which means that obviously it's just significantly slower because you don't have a lot of ways to get there. And obviously Napoleon, one of his famous maxims is spread out to survive, unite to fight. I.e. march, spread out. That way you can use multiple roads. You can spread out the as far as the foraging and the supply disposition, and then you unite, you combine yourself to actually fight. So that would be extremely difficult given the road and travel situation there. So pretty simple reason as to why the Austrians and the Russians want to do that. So Napoleon, famously, he withdraws from the Pratzen Heights here. So now this is where the feigned retreat comes in. So what Napoleon wants, and one of his famous general tactical maxims, is he wants what he calls the central position. So Napoleon, he's basically always fighting allied armies. So for the most part, he's outnumbered a significant amount of the time, but typically his force is composed of primarily French and then certain allied German states troops, but they're under his command. Where then he's fighting allied armies that have multiple different contingent countries that have their own command. So in this case, you have Austrians and Austrian command, you have Russians and Russian command, and things like that. So he likes what he calls the central position. He also famously does this at Waterloo, because what he wants is the central position so that he can then attack and deal with allied armies individually, i.e. piecemeal. We talk about defeating in detail. As opposed to allowing them to get all set up, on the field of battle. And this also, it makes total sense because one of the other basic military sayings that we have is the idea of unity of effort and unity of command. And what that means is all elements of a given military, armed force, campaign, whatever it is, they need to know what the actual goal is and the mission. Unity of effort. So they are all directed to do tasks specifically in order to accomplish whatever this one thing is. And then unity of command, which means that you don't have a convoluted command structure, so we could use, for example, so you don't have the Austrians only answer to the Austrians, the Russians only answer to the Russians have, separate lines of communication, lines of supply. The Austrians have separate, where every part of that is a crack that could be, exploited. And so that's why Napoleon likes to take his central position, is he wants to be able to exploit those things and deal with armies individually, because very typically he has superior artillery, superior infantry. The Austrians are known for having very good cavalry at this time. So, what he does by withdrawing off of the Pratzen Heights and weakening his right is he convinces the allied armies to attack his right, which is what he wants. So what he wants is for the allied armies to attempt to attack his right and weaken their center, weaken this position here on the Pratzen Heights. He intends to take the Pratzen Heights back over. He withdraws off of it. He then induces them to attack off of it and weaken that position. And then famously what he's going to do, he's going to send Soul's corps and he's going to attack back up to the Pratzen Heights. So we kind of look at this battle map. This is a pretty, compared to other battles I've done, this is actually a pretty good map. So if we look at what happens when he then orders Soul, and some of his, component, so he's got a division from Bernadotte as well, Van Damme. They attack up the Pratzen Heights here, so now he is back onto the high ground. Now the Pratzen Heights isn't super high, but he's back on the high ground, and now he is in his central position, in a position where he is now cut off a portion of the Allied army, and he has the ability to attack in multiple directions. And then there's also this river here, so it's called the Letaba River, which runs behind the battle. So I can zoom into that fairly easily. So that runs basically right here. So if you look at the Allied army, so this is the river runs this line right there. So as they're attacking Solkonitz and Telnitz, and then this is the Pretzen Heights, Napoleon takes that back over. Now he's able to drive into the Allies, where they're both pinned against forces he has in Solkonitz and Telnitz. And then if you remember the first map, we have Davout and Friant and a guy by the name of Martier marching up in order to assist. So now they're pinned against the river, pinned against Napoleon's corps in the center of Bernadotte and Soule, and then pinned against these forces here. And so essentially what he does is the obvious. He swings down from the Pretzen Heights with Soule. Soule actually gives one of his divisions, Bernadotte actually gives one of his divisions over. They absolutely crush the Allies here. Then they turn back to the north and they crush the remainder of the Allies up here. So it's just a complete and total, annihilation. Now, it needs to be said that I think one thing that gets lost in, particularly, there's kind of the Romantic era of the Napoleonic battles and things like that, is that, sometimes it appears that there was never any, danger that or that the outcome was never in, any sort of, was never up for debate, which in this case is not true. So when Napoleon originally attacks with Soule and with Bernadotte up onto the Pretzen Heights, they're initially repulsed. It's a very hard fight. They get right inside of each other, exchange volleys, and Napoleon's men are initially repulsed. But this is basically the entire plan. Is he has to take the Pretzen Heights here after getting so much of the Allied armies to follow him off of it, or to take the bait with his feigned retreat. He has to take that over in order to execute. Finally, they basically launch a last-ditch bayonet assault, carry the heights, and then the issue is settled there. Now, in addition to that, as you could see, so here this kind of shows some good movements of, Davout and Friant coming into Telnitz and Solkonitz. But if we flash back to kind of the disposition at the beginning here, and like I said, is that Friant and Davout were down by Vienna, which is about 70 miles away. So in 48 hours, so in 2 days, they force-marched multiple corps 70 miles. So guys who have been in the military, typically, so a forced march pace is considered 4 miles an hour. So your typical march pace is 3 miles an hour. So 15 miles a day is about what people can do on a consistent basis. 20 miles a day is a very hard day, and to do multiple days of that in a row. But now you're talking about doing 2 consecutive 34, 35 mile days. So if you do the math on that, let's just assume that, soldiers of this time, they would have been experienced and they would have been very, tough and hardy people. They're going to be able to carry that 3 miles an hour. So do the math. You're talking about 10 to 12 hours of marching one day and the next day to go immediately into battle, around here, around Telnitz and Solkonitz. So Napoleon was taking a very big risk by so weakening his right flank as to, draw the Allied attack out with his feigned retreat and his weakening of the right flank. He was taking a very big risk. Now, it was a calculated risk, and, one of Napoleon's greatest skills seems to be, and this is true of a lot of commanders, of his, what I consider of his elite status, is knowing their personal opposite, i.e. him knowing the commander or commanders of his opposing, enemy, and knowing their personalities, knowing the ways to get under the skin, knowing their types of decision making and things like that. So he absolutely took very big risks, but they were calculated risks. And once they had, finally, taken the Pretzen Heights, and then they could turn and fall on the rear here and push them against Solkonitz and Telnitz and against the Letaba River. And now it's kind of confusing at this time, because these used to be a bunch of ponds back in the Napoleonic era, because kind of famously, as the Allied troops were retreating across the frozen ponds, there's the, kind of the myth or the story that the French were firing artillery onto the river, onto the ponds to break the ice so that the Allied soldiers would, drown and, freeze and things like that, which it doesn't appear that that's actually true. I mean, I have no doubt that artillery shells hit the river and ponds because you're shooting artillery shells, but it actually appears that there was never any concerted effort to do that, and, there wasn't really that many people who, fell in and, like, drowned. Apparently there was a lot of stories of, like, French soldiers actually going over and helping drag out Austrians and things like that, to save them. But they captured dozens of cannons, and just basically everything that you can imagine. But, again, Napoleon's, his swan song, his masterclass here at Austerlitz, but talking the feigned retreat of that. So again, just to kind of, set up how, and again, this is, I find this to be very interesting because I kind of talked in my previous video about, two basic types of feigned retreat. One is which, you actually have a force prepared, and when you retreat, you purposely run along that route in order to draw the enemy into that prepared force. Or you have another one where you essentially withdraw, and then a predetermined signal or another signal, you basically turn back around and attack them after they've kind of broken ranks, broken formation. Now, that's not exactly the way that this worked here, but that tends to be, like, real life is different. So the feigned retreat here was Napoleon was in a relatively strong position on the Pratzen Heights here. His numbers, once he called in his reinforcements, were roughly even with the Allied armies. However, there were more Russians en route. So his feigned retreat was withdrawing from a strong position while he was politically wrangling with them and telling them he was interested in an armistice and things like that, and weakening this right flank. So in doing so, he drew the Allied armies into a position where it appeared that they had all of the advantages and should attack the obvious target being the right flank of Napoleon, in order to cut his line of communication with Vienna, and via Vienna, Germany, and and back to Paris that way. So he drew them out. Not that he drew them out into a disorganized assault, but he basically drew them to send much of their attacking force into this area here onto the flank, but weakening their center. The other component of this is that, and none of my maps are super good at this, but I probably should have done a better job of stating this sooner. But another component of this is that in the morning in this area, it's very foggy. And so Napoleon, so again, we'll flash over. So the Pratzen Heights is roughly this area here. So Napoleon hid most of Soul's corps in this area back here, which you can't tell, obviously, like now there's woods and stuff. But this is an area of low elevation, it's an elevated position, but of relatively low overall height. So he hid most of Soul's men behind this and in the fog. So that aided in that position. And when called upon, as the Allied armies were down in Solkonitz and Telnitz, then they attacked from this position straight over to there. So a little bit of use of terrain, use of weather, use of just local, climate and things like that, in order to achieve his, his absolute masterstroke. So the Third Coalition was, disbanded. I think it was 3 weeks later. So by the end of December, the Third Coalition was disbanded. The Holy Roman Empire essentially dissolved. I think technically it survived until 1806, but essentially the last remainders of it, Napoleon kept, several of the southern German, areas, which would be, he was allied with the Bavarians at the time, but you got the Bavarians, Baden-Württemberg is where this area is here. So he wanted that obviously as a buffer zone, kind of this area here, between that and where the Prussians were at the time. So the Prussians were basically seated up in this area here, and the Prussians were kind of Prussians kind of just did their own thing all the time. So regularly, obviously, they allied against Napoleon, but he wanted buffer states in Germany to keep him from other parts of the North German Confederation and the Prussians at the time. So that's kind of the end results of that. Now, obviously, the peace didn't last super long because it took us all the way until 1815 in the Battle of Waterloo, until Napoleon was defeated, kind of for the last time. But I thought that was a very good example of of a feigned retreat. I mean, honestly, probably the best historical example, as far as an absolutely decisive, feigned retreat, and just a very famous, risk taker in Napoleon, but somebody who is a very outside of the box, thinker, i.e., withdrawing from a superior position to an inferior position in order to draw the enemy into attacking what he wants to attack. Because again, what if the Allies had just not attacked, or what if they had attacked more towards the center, and not done as much in order to deal with Sokolnitz and Telnitz? Things could have been, different. But again, that's all I've got on the Battle of Austerlitz and our real life example of a feigned retreat.